Welcome to the South Carolina Maritime Museum. I'm Dedrick Bonds. Join us as we take a journey across time and many waters to explore South Carolina's Afro-Carolinian maritime world, beginning with the transatlantic slave trade from the distant shores of Africa to South Carolina. The transition of enslaved Africans to enslaved South Carolinians to freedmen and American citizen plays out over 400 years of history, forever entwined with the triumphs and tragedies that made South Carolina one of the great economic powers of the Atlantic world. The skills, labor, and adaptability of the Afro-Carolinian people formed a foundation upon which the present-day Palmetto State now rests. We will never know the exact number of Africans transported to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade, nor how many died while transported across the Atlantic during the Middle Passage. Due to lost, destroyed, or illegible records and unrecorded transactions, legal or otherwise, a completely accurate number is impossible. Yet researchers working with existing documents have managed to piece together estimates that come as close to the grim reality in terms of numbers. New discoveries and reevaluations of existing information have given us a better understanding of the complexities and geographical reach of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans came from all walks of life. They were craftsmen and warriors, pastoralists and rice growers, artisans and merchants. Others were slaves from societies where slavery had already existed in some form for centuries. They were the unfortunate, sold to pay a debt, an unwanted criminal, captured in a raid or battle, or kidnapped. Men and adults made up the majority of enslaved Africans, with a 2-to-1 ratio between men and women. Children made up a quarter of those embarked for the Americas. Far from being a single monolithic group of people, enslaved Africans came from hundreds of different ethno-linguistic groups that could be found in the regions of the transatlantic slave trade. Many captives were brought from hundreds of miles inland, their journeys taking weeks, even months to reach the coast. In some instances, they were sold multiple times during the harrowing trek before finally being sold to the captain of a waiting slave ship. Nobody knows for sure how many died along those countless journeys. For a complete understanding of the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas, learning where enslaved Africans came from is important. Researchers have divided portions of sub-Saharan Africa into 8 regions. The term Upper Guinea is also used for the 3 most northern and westerly regions. These regions were not the borders of any political or cultural entities, and there was some overlap. Since arriving in the mid-1400s along the coast of Africa, the nations of Europe competed with one another over trading rights with a multitude of African kingdoms and nation-states. Trading outposts, called factories, were established by Europeans for the purpose of buying, selling, or trading various merchandise from around the Atlantic world. European commodities, such as cloth, metalwares, and firearms, were sold or traded for African slaves and other commodities, such as gold, ivory, and various woods. European-controlled factories paid a ground rent to the local African elites. From the word factory, we get the word factor, as in a slave factor, someone who buys or sells slaves or manages transactions for other merchants. Many of the factors became quite rich and influential in Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Ship captains also served as factors during slaving voyages, having to negotiate with local African traders for goods and captives. A delicate process at times, it was not unusual for the local elite to clash with European factors and captains, sometimes with bloody results. The African slave ship. Perhaps no other object illustrates better the duality of the transatlantic slave trade. For African, American, and European merchants and traders, they were a symbol of potential wealth. What was carried abroad, both human beings and cargo, could be worth a fortune. For enslaved Africans, the slave ship was a nightmare. Chained, brutalized, and facing an unknown future, it was a living hell on water. Slave ships functioned as both floating dungeons and factories where business transaction between a ship's captain and local African traders took place. Referred to as Guineamen, the ability to transport human beings and cargo in an expedient manner was critical to the success of slaving ships. The longer a ship remained on the African coast or sailing across the Atlantic, the higher the mortality rate for both slaves and crew. Speed was critical. No matter the size of the ship, as many slaves as possible were packed below decks in order to make a voyage profitable. Neither comfort nor space was considered. A wall separated men from women and children. Above deck, a barricade, was constructed, serving the same purpose. Guineamen were often heavily armed, not only to fight off pirates and privateers, but also as a deterrent to keep slaves aboard under control. It was the duty of the ship's captain and crew to maintain control throughout the voyage, typically with the brutal use of force. Guineamen carried not only human beings to the Americas, but also a variety of goods purchased in Africa, such as ivory, elephant's teeth, various woods, camwood, redwood, palm oil, and beeswax. Although it was not typical, the sale of a slave ship immediately after disembarking the slaves at Charleston did occur, especially in the years just prior to the ban on imported slaves. While the amount of details varied, newspaper ads highlighted such features as the ship's speed, whether it was copper-sheathed, if there was ample space for slaves and cargo, and if it all had the necessary materials to make the ship a complete Guineaman. Tightly packed, gloomy darkness, the stench of sickness and unwashed bodies, the constant pain of chains rubbing exposed skin raw. So describes living conditions for enslaved Africans aboard a slave ship bound for the Americas. They were given time on deck for fresh air and exercise if sailing conditions and the captain allowed, providing some relief. The abysmal nights were spent chained in the reeking blackness below deck. For those afflicted with dysentery, fevers, seasickness, or other illnesses, the Middle Passage was especially dreadful. Mortality rates amongst the enslaved could be high. Those who perished on the voyage were unceremoniously dumped overboard. The remaining Africans who survived the Middle Passage were groomed and made presentable in the days leading up to the arrival at port. While this part of their journey was coming to an end, few could know what future awaited them. Once sold to a slave ship captain, enslaved Africans faced a bleak future, a life of bondage in the Americas or death aboard ship. Many would not accept their fate and resisted by any means necessary. Some refused to eat. The captain, not wanting to lose their valuable slaves, pried their mouths open and forced food down their throats. Others tried to jump overboard, as death by drowning or being eaten by sharks was preferable by some over a life of enslavement and a future in a distant, unknown land. To prevent this, crews put up netting to catch would-be jumpers. The ultimate form of resistance was open revolt against the slave ship's crew. Insurrections were not uncommon occurrences aboard slave ships. It was the last desperate chance at freedom. Many were bloody affairs. The best possible chance of success was when the ship was still along the African coast. With shore so near, freedom was still a possibility. Once the Guineamen sailed for the Americas, that chance of escape slowly faded. Arming themselves with anything that could be used as a weapon, captives turned on the crew. Success meant freedom if you could swim or paddle your way to shore. On the open ocean, however, having companions with experience sailing a large ship was vital. Otherwise, possible starvation and death awaited the survivors as the now crewless ship slowly meandered along the waves. While most slave ship insurrections ended in failure, with the instigators executed or brutally beaten, some were successful, as in the case of La Amistad in 1839. Beginning in the 1710s, South Carolina experienced a rising trend in the importation of slaves directly from Africa, particularly after the rapid expansion of indigo and rice growing in the mid-1700s. During the formation years of the colony, African slaves accompanied their owners to the shores of Carolina. Later, slaves were imported from the Caribbean, of which some were from Africa, while others had already been established on the plantation of English-controlled islands such as Antigua, Barbados, Jamaica, and St. Kitts. Charlestown, today's Charleston, as the dominant port of trade in South Carolina, became the primary point of disembarkation for slaves coming directly from Africa or from other colonies in the Americas as a part of the intercolonial slave trade. In regards to the other two main ports of colony, Beaufort and Georgetown, only Beaufort imported slaves directly from Africa. Africans that arrived in Georgetown came via Charleston first. The transatlantic slave trade to South Carolina over the years was far from steady. High import duties, laws prohibiting imported slaves, privateering, and especially war caused the slave trade to come to a grinding halt at times. The War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739 through 1748, and the American Revolution, 1775 through 1782, saw the trade all but vanish. However, once pace resumed, duties lowered or lifted, and laws expired rescinded, the slave trade resumed with renewed vigor. With the passage of the Act prohibiting importation of slaves in 1807, effective January 1st, 1808, the last 3 years of the legal transatlantic slave trade to South Carolina reached its highest levels. Almost 55,000 Africans were estimated to have disembarked from 1805 through 1807, some 27,000 in 1807 alone. Ships from Africa sailed all times of the year, although they primarily arrived in South Carolina during the summer months. For the enslaved Africans, summertime heat caused sweltering conditions below deck. Even in wintertime, cooler air from the north, even in the milder climate of the waters near the equator and Caribbean, could take its toll, creating bone-chilling conditions for Africans not used to such weather. Clothes and or blankets would be provided if such precautions were taken by ship captains to protect their valuable slaves. Once slave ships began sailing directly to South Carolina from Africa in the early 1700s, it was common to have the same ship making multiple trips to the colony and later the state. Such is the case of the ship Hector and its captain William Yellowin, which traveled to South Carolina 3 times. What could possibly be the largest number of African slaves imported into South Carolina arrived aboard the British ship Comte de Nord in Comte du Nord, 1784, with some 600 Africans, and the United States ship Washington in 1805 with 530. One of the largest, if not the largest, mass sale in South Carolina history of newly imported slaves from Africa was held in Charlestown on Tuesday, June 8, 1773. In total, 1,345 very prime and healthy slaves were advertised for sale from 9 different ships. During the era of the transatlantic slave trade, at least 5 slave ships are known to have wrecked along the South Carolina coast. In these reported wrecks, all of the enslaved Africans and crews were rescued. For over 400 years, enslaved Africans were sent to the Americas. Beginning in the late 1700s, opinions began shifting regarding the transatlantic slave trade. The brutality and dehumanizing effect the trade had on not only the Africans, but the American and European ship crews as well helped bring an end to the trade. In 1807, the passage of Great Britain's Slave Trade Act and the United States Act prohibiting importation of slaves marked the legal end to the importation of slaves across the British Empire, effective May 1st, 1807, and into the United States, effective January 1st, 1808. This was the beginning of the end for the transatlantic slave trade. However, African slaves continued to be transported to Spanish-controlled islands in the Caribbean and to South America. Slave smugglers attempted to outsail the Royal and United States navies, now on the hunt for slave ships. Smugglers began sailing faster ships, but in many cases, smaller ships, in their effort to deliver Africans to would-be buyers in the Americas. Sadly, slaves were packed into those ships in greater numbers than before. A number of Guineamen sailed into Charleston as 1807 came to an end. The brig Rio from Cabinda, with 214 slaves, might have been the last slave ship to legally enter South Carolina, arriving December 30th, 1807. By this point in time, South Carolina was exporting its own slaves, including newly arrived Africans, west to the Louisiana and Mississippi territories. Attempts were made in the 1850s for South Carolina to reopen the slave trade to Africa, a proposition which ultimately failed. Yet, smugglers and slave traders repeatedly attempted to traffic African slaves into the country. The Wanderer, a former New York racing yacht, is perhaps the most notorious of American slave ships. Having departed Charleston on July 4, 1858, she sailed for the Congo River, embarking 487 Africans. Evading blockading warships, the Wanderer disembarked 487 slaves at Jekyll Island, Georgia, on November 28, 1858. Ultimately, the Wanderer was seized by the authorities, becoming a Union Navy vessel during the Civil War. Those responsible for illegally transporting the Africans to the United States were tried, but none were convicted, creating further tension between the North and the South. Descended from enslaved Africans that once worked the plantations of low-country South Carolina, the Gullah people of today form a unique group that incorporates a blending of various African and American English arts and crafts, foodways, linguistics, and other cultural practices. This creolization goes back centuries and is especially noticeable in Gullah speech. Utilizing speech from various African dialects, from as far south as Angola to as far north and west as Gambia, many words can be traced back to the primary rice-growing regions of West Africa, particularly from Liberia north through Sierra Leone and Guinea into the Senegambia region. With the increase of rice production during the mid-1700s, South Carolina planters, in need of laborers with knowledge of rice growing, looked to these areas of West Africa for slaves. The combination of African rice planting techniques with English, later American mercantilism, brought great wealth to the colony and later state of South Carolina. The Gullah language is similar to some of the Creole, or trade languages, spoken during the days of the transatlantic slave trade, and by some Afro-Caribbean people today, whether it is a combination of Afro-English, Afro-French, or Afro-Portuguese Spanish. Like many traditional practices, future generations must learn the ways of the past, or possibly forever lose these distinctive and culturally significant practices.